Good afternoon and happy Juneteenth. My name is Erica Gumake, a recent Rice University graduate, Texas criminal justice intern, and a medical student at UT Southwestern. Welcome to the first of many panels brought to you by the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition and the Convict Leasing and Labor Project. Today's series, History Exposed, How Emancipation Didn't Mean Freedom, will dive into various topics, including slavery, convict leasing, hidden Black history, and more. Before we begin, we are very happy to not only be holding this panel today, but also celebrating it on Juneteenth. If some don't know the historical significance behind Juneteenth, I'm going to pass it off to my fellow moderator, Olivia, to explain.
Thanks, Erica. Hey everyone, I'm Olivia Gomake, a Rice University graduate and current Rice MBA student, as well as a Texas Criminal Justice Coalition intern. On June 19th, 1865, Major General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, no more than an hour south from inner city Houston, and announced the end of the Civil War and the institution of slavery. But what many people may not know is that a common misconception about Juneteenth is that on June 19th, 1865, all slaves from all over the country were freed at the same time. However, the true history of Juneteenth is not that it was the day that slavery ended for everyone, but more so a day that marks when enslaved Black Texans discovered the news that they had been free for over 2 years. The Emancipation Proclamation was signed on January 1st, 1863 by Abraham Lincoln. But many slave owners continued to keep African Americans enslaved after the signing of the piece of legislation. Therefore, what is widely celebrated as the day slavery ended actually serves as a symbolic date of African American freedom. Juneteenth is a day of gains and losses for the Black community, a day of reflection, meditation, and commemoration, a day we remember the freedom granted to all slaves, but are reminded of the progress that we are continuously fighting for. Black people are fighting for joy and equality to this very day, today, as is displayed in our current socio-political climate, and Juneteenth is a day that represents just that. So while our panel discussion centers around an iteration of slavery, convict leasing, today, we must continue to remember the significance of this day and hold space for African Americans and their ancestors who were and continue to be subjected to oppressive systems, beginning with the implementation of slavery. Now that we understand a little of the historical context of today, I'm going to pass it along to my fellow intern and moderator, Jasmine, to introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Olivia. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jasmine Smith, a rising junior at Rice and Texas Criminal Justice Coalition intern. I have the supreme honor of introducing our speaker today. Our speaker today is a native Houston Texan from 3rd Ward and current doctoral candidate at the Department of History at University of Texas at Austin. He earned his A.B. in history with a certificate in law and society. He will be defending his thesis in the upcoming weeks that centers around interrogating the Texas sugar industry's role in the state prison system in the late 19th and early 20th century. His work also examines Black male incarcerations within the time period and their intergenerational impact of Black Texan communities at large, So please join me in welcoming Mr. Jermaine Thibodeaux. Before we begin, is there anything you'd like to add to your bio?
No, I think that's pretty much, that sums it up for the most part. I will say, if I can, it's great to see a lot of my former middle school students in the attendees room from St. John's over in Houston. So it's great to see a lot of you actually, making me a little nervous. So hi, everybody.
Well, I just want to say thank you again for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks.
So for those who are unfamiliar with the institution of convict leasing and what it is exactly, could you please explain to us what convict leasing is? Also, given it's not centered around the aspect of history being taught, could you provide us with a greater historical context of the institution?
Yes. So convict leasing, I guess, as the name suggests, it was a systematic, punitive labor economic policy adopted by many states, particularly in the American South, in the years following the American Civil War. And this system gave private industry and various states full access to incarcerated laboring bodies. So people who were imprisoned, their labor was now fully available to the highest bidder. So by that, again, I mean that private companies in the states, they could lease out convicts to perform labor in a variety of industries. And in the process, both the state and the industrialists and sometimes planters would benefit financially from the labor performed by those imprisoned individuals. So in many southern states, industrialists or planters, they would basically lease out the entire or portions of the prison populations to put to work. And again, the state would be handsomely compensated and sometimes let off the hook when it came to providing care for these inmates and ensuring their well-being as a group. We know that convict leasing afforded southern state governments and white elites in particular a way to sort of live as if chattel slavery had not been abolished, right? Which is why you sometimes hear scholars and lay persons refer to convict leasing as slavery by another name, or an institution that is sometimes dubbed as worse than slavery. So essentially, convicts, once they were put to work in these varied environments, they lacked basic rights or employee rights or employment rights that you would typically associate with those who were working outside of the sort of the construct of the confines of the prison. They did not receive any compensation for their labor typically. And the jobs they performed were usually grueling and taxing on their bodies and their psychologies. But unlike slavery, I would say that the convict lease system did not endeavor to protect the laborers, the prisoners, right, in the same fashion. Enslavers, for example, they had an economic imperative to keep the enslaved reasonably healthy and safe. But the industrialists and the planters post-Civil War, they did not feel the need to, they didn't feel such a mandate, right? So in fact, they often viewed convict labor as so plentiful and so cheap and so reliable that a common refrain is that when one died, so one convict laborer died, you simply got another. So these bodies in the minds of the industrialists, the planter classes, these were disposable bodies and their lives were equally dispensable in the eyes of some. So this system, in many ways, was a major part of the Southern labor system post-Civil War. And we'll talk more in depth about what that actually meant for sort of the economic lifeblood of the South post-bellum, all right?
Yeah, speaking of the economic implications that you briefly mentioned, I know you said the compensation came through the state. And we just had another question on, do you have kind of an approximate quantitative amount or of influence that the convict leasing labor brought to the South or brought to the nation in whole? And then also what types of institutions or corporations benefited from convict leasing labor specifically? I know you did mention the state, but was it also private through privatization and things like that?
Right, so I don't come bearing specific numbers. I know sometimes that's quite annoying for a lot of folks, but I'll give you a few numbers, right? In a nutshell, I would argue that, and many historians before me have argued this, that simply put, convict labor, from convict leasing to the chain gangs and even debt peonage, they helped build what we call the modern South. So you look at places like Georgia, Alabama, parts of Mississippi, the levees, some of the levees in Louisiana, and certainly the railroads and certain parts of infrastructure in Texas. These things were built by convict labor. Extensive use of convict labor. So again, roads, government buildings, key parts of Southern infrastructure relied on labor extracted from convict bodies, right? Entire industries in the region were also buoyed by the use of convict labor. So in Texas specifically, we have the railroads, you have the cotton industry. Texas was one of the leading cotton producers in the country. The iron industries, the timber industries, and of course my favorite, the sugar industry, all directly benefited from the use of incarcerated persons, right? The state capitol building in Austin, Texas, for example, was rebuilt by convict laborers after a devastating fire in 1881. And I'll obviously talk more in depth about the role of convict labor to the state's sugar industry, but know this, there's a figure that floats around in a lot of the scholarship about Texas convict leasing and convict labor. I would argue around the late 1880s up through the early 19 teens, historians have estimated that convict labor brought in about 3% of the state's revenue, which is a significant amount. 3% seems very small or minuscule to some, but today, or at least I think the last time I looked, maybe 2017, maybe 2019, the oil and natural gas and oil revenues in the state constituted about 1.7% of the state budget. So if you can imagine, with double that, you get a sense of just how much money poured into the state treasury because of because of convict labor. And I'll also say that one of the key benefits of using, I wouldn't say benefits of using, but one of the reasons why many state governments turned to convict leasing was to ensure that the taxpayers, for the most part, were left off the hook. Many southern states did not want to fund their prisons by using taxpayer dollars. So these institutions, which emerged mostly after the Civil War, in fact, we can talk more about that in depth later, these new prisons, these new institutions, people wanted them to exist for the most part, but they didn't want to fund them. They didn't want to pay their taxes to support criminals in their minds. So it was imperative that most of these prisons be self-sufficient, and Texas was no exception to that. So, by any means necessary, it was sort of I hate to use that phrase, but the state essentially said, we're going to have our prisons, but they're going to be self-sufficient. And by self-sufficient, no taxpayer monies will be directed toward those institutions. So we need to do whatever we can to ensure that the money would be rolling in. And so convict leasing provided the state with an alternative to taxpaying, to taxpayer revenue. So, the lessees, the people who leased out the convicts, they essentially were keeping the Texas prison system afloat for decades. So the system, the state became wedded to and dependent upon the system itself, simply to avoid overtaxing, if you will, the citizens of Texas. So I guess, to summarize again, convict leasing, it should not be understated that the role of convict labor post-slavery was tremendous, again, in sort of building up what we call a modern South, the roads in Georgia, the roads that pretty much connect many of the southern states through the upper South. A lot of those roads were built by convicts. And again, in Texas, the railroads that we rely on to move our agricultural and livestock, many of those railroads were also built by convict labor. So a huge economic and political impact on Texas and the American South.
Yeah, that's powerful, because reiterating what you just said about its convict leasing and the labor of the convicts, the economic and political kind of gain that the South, and specifically the state of Texas had, it's very interesting to think of, because they were such a driver of the economic bedrock of Texas, as well as, politically trying to prevent taxpayers from having to pay for prisons. It does, I think, begets the question of, when did convict labor get phased out, and why, if it was such a huge economic and political driver for the state of Texas and the South?
Right. So even though it was for Texas a sort of an economic gold mine, if you will, a boon for the state, it was always controversial, right? especially as more details about the treatment or mistreatment of convicts became public, and sort of the internecine politics of how, you know, prisons are funded, who would be in charge, et cetera. A lot of those political questions provoked a lot of public discussion and outcry over time. So in a nutshell, I would say public pressure, mainly brought about by sort of what we call muckraking journalists. They wrote these interesting, long articles that would appear in prominent Texas newspapers, exposing the prison system for what it was, right? So that public pressure and a shifting political landscape, at least by the early 1900s, right, pretty much spelled the demise of the convict leasing system in Texas. In 1906, Texans elected this relatively, I guess we would call him progressive governor at the time, named Thomas Campbell. And Campbell, I think he was one of the first native Texan governors. I could be wrong there, so don't quote me. He was forced to take action on the prison situation because he'd heard, and, you know, members of the legislature, they'd been reading what the press was writing about the corruption and the mistreatment and the conditions of these prisons and prison camps. So he was forced to essentially prioritize prison reform on his agenda, but he was pushed, again, forced by journalists. So after this huge investigation in 1909, the state legislature quickly jumped to sweeping reforms in a summer session in 1910, which ultimately included the abolition of convict leasing. So I will say, even though I pointed out public pressure, which is kind of vague and broad, and I focus on the role of journalists, the inmates or the convicts themselves deserve some credit because they told their stories to people who could in many ways help enact change. The fact that they did not always remain silent. And by the convicts, I do mean sort of a multiracial group of folks who spoke out against some of the injustices and conditions in the prison camps and the prison farms. So they also deserve a lot of credit, even though historians don't typically sort of center their activism, if you will. But yeah, so the system ultimately fades out after, you know, after 1910, and by 1914, I believe, there were, you know, the system was fully gone. All prisoners worked for the state, right, and on state property. That's important. They not only worked for the state, but they worked on state property. They weren't leased out. They no longer worked on share farms across the state. Everybody now worked for the state of Texas and lived on Texas property.
You talked a lot about the contributions or the type of products that were centered in convict leasing. It was iron, cotton, and specifically sugar, which is what your dissertation centers on. And so I was wondering what the role of the sugar industry played in shaping the state prisons and convict labor policies.
So most people, myself included, do not know that Texas had a fairly robust sugar industry in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Most people think of domestically produced sugar as, you know, something straight out of Louisiana and or Hawaii, which comes along a little later. But Texas, you know, we were the second largest producer of sugar in the domestic United States for a long time. I think now maybe Florida today surpasses Louisiana, but I'm not totally sure. But in any case, Texas had a fairly robust antebellum sugar industry. It waned or died out pretty much because of the Civil War and because of the emancipation of enslaved laborers, right? But the people who lived in the quote unquote Texas Sugar Bowl, which is a compilation of several counties in the state, Wharton County sometimes, Fort Bend County, Matagorda County, and Brazoria County. We tend to call those the Sugar Bowl. That's where most of the sugar cane was grown. In those counties were some of the most influential people in the state of Texas, right? These were well-connected folks, not only economically, they had a lot of power, but they also were involved in politics. They had a lot of friends in high places, as we would say. So when the Texas sugar industry dies out or starts to wane during and shortly after the Civil War, I'd like to give credit to this trio from Galveston, Dewey, Ward, and Patton, businessmen and planters with extensive land holdings, and lots of friends who also grew and planted sugar. They needed labor. They needed people to continue to cultivate cane on their properties if they were to be successful themselves. So long story short, when the state of Texas decides that it needs someone essentially to take up the mantle and essentially fund the prisons, when these three, they were actually a company, Ward and Dewey, when they submitted their bid to lease out the prisons, the formula just worked, right? As I said, they were well connected to other planters in the area. So what Ward and Dewey did was they leased out the state prison up in Huntsville. They took the mostly Black prisoners, the convicts, and conveyed them down into the Sugar Bowl region and allowed their friends and other sort of fellow planters to sublease convicts and put them to work on their plantations as well. So what this does, it essentially sort of revitalizes the Texas sugar industry. But what I argue in my own work is it provides an interesting formula for the state penitentiary system, because now the state sees that sugar is an interesting way to put, or an interesting way to get this increasingly Black prison population out of the walls of Huntsville and onto these plantations doing agricultural work that, in the minds of many, this was a kind of labor that these Black convicts were most accustomed to and best equipped for. So I argue that sugar, which has long served as sort of the sugar's always been associated, at least in the Western world, I think, Atlantic world, with sort of slavery. They kind of fed each other, and slavery, at least Atlantic African slavery, is we say that sugar was the crop that brought chattel slavery, the plantation complex to the New World, if you will. We see a continuation of that in Texas because this industry, or this waning industry, has some really influential Texans behind it who are determined to make it work again. And so when they turn to these Black convicts or turn to the state penitentiary system for labor, they essentially fall back on what I call sort of old racial and gender fictions, meaning that within the Southern or just American Atlantic world context, Black labor and sugar work went hand in hand. We oftentimes think of cotton work or cotton cultivation as sort of the thing that slaves did, or old slaves, enslaved persons did. But sugar had, I think in my mind, had a really strong connection to enslavement. And this is important, sugar labor was oftentimes tied to a particular demographic, meaning Black men, right? So if you look at sugar cultivation in places like Louisiana, for example, and even in antebellum Texas, there was a strong preference for Black male slaves to do that really gruesome and arduous sugar cultivation. The same sort of mentality was transferred during sort of the age of convict leasing. You have all these captive Black male bodies. Sugar seemed to be the optimal crop to put them to work in. And I later talk about in my own work why cotton was largely rejected by the state prison system. Because over time, cotton becomes, in Texas, it becomes a crop that is really much so tied to whiteness, more so than anything. So in any case, sugar provided a way for, white elites in Texas to essentially re-embrace these old racial and gendered fictions. There were these ideas about Black intellectual and physical abilities that sugar work, for some reason, seemed to best exploit in many ways. So, the sugar industry just seemed in many ways to be like a logical and seamless fit for this sort of leasing project that the state took on. And it becomes the model, or it became the model, for the agricultural labor that the prison system relied on after sugar is no longer a crop of note in Texas at the end of the 1920s. That was a kind of convoluted way around it, but I hope you got something from it. I'll clarify if people have questions.
Yeah, no, I understand that. So when we're talking about the sugar companies specifically and the sugar plantations, could you describe the conditions of those incarcerated laborers? And I also was going to ask about the demographics, which you addressed already, which makes sense. But if you do know any other data about the demographics along with the conditions, that would be great to hear.
Right, so men exclusively worked in sugar in Texas. And, both in the antebellum period in Texas and Louisiana, there was a strong preference for male sugar workers, right? There was always a skewed gender ratio on sugar plantations. They oftentimes had more men on those plantations than women because of the nature of the work. Sugar work was notoriously, it was notorious amongst the enslaved and even whites. Throughout the antebellum period, they would comment on, if you get sent to that devil Louisiana, you most likely were going to die prematurely because sugar work was just that tough. The same with Texas. We get, sugar land being referred to much later as the hellhole on the Brazos. A lot of that has to do with, the horrible climate and the conditions that lead to, I guess, early deaths or mortality amongst sugar workers, convicts. So your question was on the demographics. Women didn't do much work. And this is important. Most of the sugar workers from the Texas prison system were Black workers. Again, the state did not want white men working in sugar. Occasionally, there would be some white sugar workers. Occasionally, a few Mexicans would do some sugar labor, but overwhelmingly, the labor force was Black, right? Sugar work is hard work. It's sort of a year-round cyclical set of affairs. It's dangerous because you're wielding a sharp machete or cane knife. The sugar stalks are very heavy. There's a lot of lifting. There's also, transporting these cane stalks to the sugar houses with roaring fires. So there were all kinds of dangers lurking on the sugar plantations that, and obviously the sort of the tropical-like climate did not always work well for many of the convict laborers. So if you see the medical records, you would see a lot of sunstrokes, heat strokes, a lot of injuries because of those cane knives, etc. So the conditions were, again, historically deplorable. Most enslaved persons would cry about being sent downriver to go work in Louisiana and to work in cane because they knew that, the likelihood of coming out of that, was not too great. So in any case, the fact that Texas relied on or placed most of its Black convicts on sugar plantations, I think it undergirded or underscores sort of again, what I mentioned earlier, the sort of racial fictions and gender fictions that were that were pervasive in sort of white Southern spaces at the time, right? Black men can deal with this because they are, the quintessential beast of burdens, right? Black men could not work within the walls of the Huntsville prison or in some of the iron foundries because that involved a sort of more sophisticated set of intellectual inquiry and endeavor. So agricultural work, especially sugar work, was deemed ideal for this particular demographic. And it's interesting to see some of the people who, the chief promulgators of this sort of racialist language. One, it's kind of a well-known fact is I think the first or second president of the University of Texas, Mr. Winston, he spoke at a prison convention in Austin, I believe, where he talked about why Black men especially were supremely fit to do this particular kind of labor because anything else was asking simply too much, and they did not have the capacity to think and do other types of labor. So sugar, it's linked to slavery, racial and even gendered conventions of the day. So that's why I really wanted to focus on that, but also to think about the ways that the sugar plantation and that type of labor later informs how the state arranges its convict laboring practices. Because after sugar, there's sort of the state goes back to cotton production and some other agricultural items or crops. But sugar provides the blueprint. It allows the state to justify and to continue to racially and gender segregate its convict laboring classes. Okay.
Yeah, that's like amazing. I wanted to highlight a little bit of what you said about the racial and gender fixations that were pervasive in the South, specifically in the sugar industry and the harsh conditions. And it kind of has me thinking about, we know about mass incarceration today, maybe not collectively, but a lot, like I'm sure you and historians and people who study it understand the impact not only on these convicts in the harsh conditions, but also intergenerational impact. And it had me kind of thinking, do you have any record of the intergenerational impact convict leasing had on not only the convict themselves, but their families and their loved ones, and how that's kind of shown historically to today?
So that was one of my biggest sort of missions when I started this project. I wanted to see, how Black families in Texas sort of grappled with what I would call mass incarceration. And I would actually change, I wanted to push the periodization of mass incarceration. Most people think it starts, 60s, 70s. I argue, and it's some newer scholarship, we go back to slavery. Well, immediately after slavery, we start to see a ramping up of a mostly Black, poor prison population. But to answer your question, it has been very challenging to, one, locate records of convicts post their prison stay, and to actually glean a lot of sort of the family information to sort of really assess the intergenerational impact. I tried. Quickly, I went to the Texas State Archives in Austin, and I thought I hit a gold mine. I was going to look at pardon requests to see, to try to gain more biographical information about some of the incarcerated folks, because in the pardon request, you would get letters from people from their communities, and you get a fuller write-up of sort of their behavior patterns, et cetera, while incarcerated. I hit a snafu with that. I found a few really interesting pardon applications, but in the midst of maybe my third box or so, the archivist came over to my table to tell me that I was not allowed to look at those records because they contained records, pardon requests from people, surprisingly, who were still alive, and they basically hadn't filed them appropriately. So I'm going to save some of that for the book once those records have been properly processed. But I will give you this anecdote. From the records that are available, I do know that a lot of these men return to prison, return to the sugar plantations, the prison farms, after sometimes 2, 3, 4 times over the course of their lives, right? And so I think it's easy to infer what that meant for Black families and Black communities throughout Texas, right? The disappearing of Black men from communities, from households, and sort of what kind of impact, disparate impact that might have on, again, families and communities. But I want more concrete information, and I think I'll be doing that. That will probably delay the publication, or no, but it'll certainly help me like have a richer study. But there is one anecdote that is, I don't know if it's as well known, to think about the intergenerational impact of this type of incarceration. That most of us know the famed Texas Congresswoman Barbara Jordan, from Houston, 5th Ward. Barbara Jordan always talked about her grandfather. She called him Big Ben. Big Ben was a small shopkeeper in 5th Ward. Well, he actually got into a scuffle one day in his little shop in 5th Ward. He was being robbed, and he basically found his pistol and tried to follow the thief out of his store, chase him down. And this story seems so weird it seems weird to the point that it almost seems untrue. But in any case, he chases this man into the street. The thief evades him, and he fires his pistol almost indiscriminately, and he actually strikes a police officer. So Ben Jordan ends up in prison for attempted murder, and he's sent to the Sugar Land area to basically work on some of these prison farms. Now, he didn't necessarily cultivate sugar, because by this time sugar cane wasn't really growing in this area, but he worked very hard. In any case, once he served his time, he was released, he returned home. And one of the greatest joys of his life, which had been interrupted, was meeting and sort of getting acquainted with his new granddaughter, who was Barbara Jordan. Barbara Jordan was stuck to her grandfather for many, many years. They were sort of peas in the pod. And she almost never really talked about his prison experience, but she did note how it changed him, and obviously how it changed the dynamic of her family, and what kind of, how they entered into a more extreme poverty because of his absence. So I think that story, while rather exceptional, in many ways, I think it's also representative, perhaps, of what many Black families had endured because of this sort of ramping up of in terms of incarcerating young Black men and disappearing them from their communities and their families. So obviously the social dislocation of actually moving them out of the communities, that had effects on, again, those neighborhoods, those communities, those towns, but it also obviously would have had an effect on families. So as a historian, I just have to find, some empirical data and records to validate that claim, because I think we obviously see that now. When we talk about mass incarceration and the breakdown of the Black family, and all families who are, victims of mass incarceration, or over incarceration in our country. So I'm on it, to answer your question. I'm on it. It exists. I just need more concrete examples to make the case.
Yeah, we have a bunch of more questions, but I think we want to make sure that we can allow some Q&A questions, because this information is just so interesting. So yeah, I think we're going to segue, and Jazz will start with the Q&A with a couple of questions in the chat.
And I'll try to keep my responses brief.
Your responses are great.
My students know I can be a little long-winded before I get to the point.
We saw one, and as a Black woman, I am interested in this question, but I was interested in finding out what type of work were Black women usually assigned to during the convict leasing system, if at all, and in the context of the prison/punishment reform for women, how did Black women fit into this and get left behind?
That's from Christy Dawson, one of my former students, Stanford grad. Hey, Christy. Black women made up a small chunk of the prison population in Texas. I think in most years that rarely did those numbers sort of hover over or exceed maybe 200 plus. But Black women did a lot of agricultural work on farms near the Huntsville prison, the Johnson farm, and I believe the Eastman farm. And it's very interesting, Black women were typically segregated from white women. There was a racial division of labor on these farms, whereas Black women were confined to field labor, growing peas and all kinds of vegetables and things in support of the larger prison apparatus. White women oftentimes served as domestics, babysitters. They did the work indoors and in the house. Talitha LaFloria wrote an excellent book about the role of incarcerated Black women within sort of the convict leasing or convict labor regime in Georgia. And a lot of the truths unveiled in her book paralleled the Texas experience. Just there was rampant sexual abuse, physical abuse endured by Black women and all women on these camps. In fact, one of the, I call her one of the leading sort of prison reformers in Texas, doesn't get a lot of credit, was an illiterate Black woman who wrote to the governor and pretty much outlined in graphic detail some of the things, the perversions that had transpired during her time in prison. And that sort of raised a red flag for the governor, who made sure that some of these things were investigated. Conditions didn't immediately change for women, and especially Black women, but there was some gradual improvement over time. But as in many of these southern states, I think the types of work that Black women in particular did, was very reminiscent of slavery era labor. But in some places, again, like Georgia, with LaFloria, she shows us that Black women also did some unexpected tasks like blacksmithing and working in really hard industrial laboring environments. But in Texas, it was mostly agricultural work as well.
Wow, that was actually really interesting. I guess our last question would be, how did you become interested in this research field?
Well, it's a long story. I started grad school interested in slavery, and I was really interested in Black, white children and their sort of interactions with each other, and what happened in that moment when they had to recognize race and sort of unfriend each other, as we would say today, like these unlikely attachments. What happens when you sort of break those bonds. But folks had started to dabble in that topic, and I think someone from Rice actually wrote a dissertation about something fairly similar. I later became really interested in sugar plantations and sort of the gendered dimensions of those sugar plantations. And I was blown away to learn just how sugar plantations were these hyper masculine homosocial spaces where men were in the majority. And they had all kinds of interesting social relations with each other and with the white workers, the overseers and the planters, etc. So I was really interested in sort of how manhood and notions of masculinities were made and unmade on these sugar plantations. But while in grad school in Austin, I hated Austin. I longed for Houston. I finished my coursework and I said, I'm going back to Houston. I needed to figure out a dissertation topic because I didn't really want to go do research in Louisiana and try to track down records in French. Until I read something. Oh, this is around the time when the new Jim Crow was also jumping and everybody was talking about mass incarceration. But I also discovered, prisons are interesting carceral spaces, a lot of parallels to slavery. But I was still drawn to sugar. I realized Texas had a sugar industry, that Texas had expansive sugar plantations. And when I discovered that the Texas penitentiary system was intimately connected to the sugar industry, I just thought, you know, everything had come together, but I still hadn't figured out what precisely would I try to get at in my own work. And so I think over time, recognizing that a lot of that history hadn't been told or published. There are lots of great dissertations and theses on the Texas prisons and the history of the Texas prison system, but you know, a lot of that work is unpublished. And Texas Tough, the book comes out by Robert Perkinson. He talks about you know, imperial sugar, which is a staple in almost any Texas household, I think. Sugarland nearby, grew up near it, had no idea this stuff was happening literally in my own backyard. And so I was hooked. I wanted to learn more. I wanted to uncover more. And then, you know, having an uncle who, my students, so let's talk about it, having an uncle who pretty much has been incarcerated for my entire adult life, for the most part, and driving to the Sugarland area to go visit him a few times, you know, in my childhood. I don't know, I kept the prison space, those carceral spaces in the back of my mind, wondering like what it's like to live and work in those kinds of spaces. So as I learned more about slavery, for me, I also became more curious about, you know, carcerality and prisons. And so, long story short, I was able to meld my two interests in many ways, like the sugar plantations, which were fascinating, but also these spaces, the prisons that I hadn't, you know, I didn't know too much about it, about them. And so fortune, sheer good luck, offered, you know, me a chance to basically explore the two dynamics together. And here I am. So I guess my ultimate argument in my work is that the sugar industry was crucial to the development and expansion of the Texas prison system. And, you know, it had some obvious insidious effects on Black Texas life from 1843 to 1920. Okay.
Well, we're super grateful and honored to have been able to have you on here for this discussion as three Black women and three Black women who are Indigenous to Houston, the Houston greater area. We're grateful for the work because, you know, we've been barely scratching the surface of this history, and you know, it's fascinating, but at the same time, it's heart-wrenching to understand the history that Black people have been subjected to. So we're just super grateful for your work and continuing to contribute to the literature, speaking truth. And so I think we're going to pass it over to Jay, our boss.
No, y'all, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, my name is Jay Jenkins, and I'm the Harris County Project Attorney with the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, and I'm also the Vice President and the co-founder of the Convict Leasing and Labor Project. I want to thank our brilliant guest, Jermaine Thibodeaux, today for giving us his time. We're going to continue this conversation, Jermaine, and keep you posted on our work in Sugarland, and we hope you'll do the same as you continue on this great path. I want to thank our great hosts, Olivia, Jazz, and Erica, along with everyone else that's helped work on this, Hannah, Ingrid, Elaine, Aviva, Dr. Montz, all the other folks that have helped, our partners at Spectrum Fusion that are currently digitizing all of the records that we're finding from back in the convict leasing era, and everyone at TCJC's Austin office and the CLLP board. We also want to thank especially the founder and president of CLLP, Reginald Moore, and his wife, Marilyn, who've been so great. So given the focus of his research, we could not have picked a better guest for the first episode of this series. Mr. Thibodeaux's insight into the connection between the gruesome and racist history of the convict leasing system and how it reaches into the racist system of mass incarceration that exists today is the perfect way to highlight the partnership between TCJC and CLLP on this important racial justice work. TCJC, which recently celebrated its 20th birthday, is an organization dedicated to fixing the injustices of the criminal legal system and building stronger and safer communities. The Convict Leasing and Labor Project was founded in 2018 and is focused on telling the stories of convict leasing and its impact on our world today. Rather than expound on the CLLP's mission further, the brilliant Hannah Kim has written both CLLP's newest report on convict leasing and has done an amazing video that gives us a little bit of a background on the convict leasing system and also what CLLP does as an organization. So we're going to have Elaine play that video for y'all now, and then we'll check in with y'all afterwards. Go ahead, Elaine. Ooh, are we having trouble with the audio? All right. Well, maybe we will put that video up on our website, y'all, for y'all, while we get the audio figured out. It's amazing, and
not telling the full.
Here we go.
Many Americans learn about white resistance to African American freedom that followed the Civil War and the Reconstruction era. Jim Crow laws, lynchings, and the Ku Klux Klan are some of the well-known chapters of racial terrorism in U.S. history. But America is not telling the full history. An important but little-known effort to bring back slavery after the Civil War has been passed over, left unexplained, and swept under the rug. After the Civil War devastated the South, its prison system became the testing ground for crafting a reincarnation of slavery. Convict leasing was a system in which Southern states leased prisoners to private businesses. Convict leasing criminalized and essentially re-enslaved Black men, women, and even children who had been deemed free and equal by the Constitution's 13th Amendment. Yes, the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, except as a punishment for crime. This was a big loophole. Unfair laws called the Black Codes, harsh policing, white vigilante actions, and lack of due process in court all led to convictions. And then the convicts, who were often completely innocent, were turned over to a system of labor exploitation. They were forced to work from sunup to sundown in order to pay off the fines for their supposed crimes. African Americans were the vast majority of convict leasing's victims. Those who leased the convicts often requested them specifically by race. Everyone involved in running this lucrative system profited from forcing these prisoners to work under inhumane conditions that looked a lot like slavery. The 13th Amendment was turned into a tool for re-enslavement. More than a century after a quiet ending of Texas convict leasing system in 1912, a field in a prosperous Texas suburb would bring this forgotten history to life.
Story out of Sugar Land, where a construction site has turned into an excavation site. Crews working on a Fort Bend
in February 2018, Fort Bend Independent School District in Sugar Land, Texas, discovered human remains in what turned out to be an unmarked gravesite while constructing a school facility. By the summer, the remains of 94 men and 1 woman, now known as a Sugar Land 95, were excavated and put inside storage pods. All of them were African American convict lease prisoners who worked and died in the sugar plantations of Sugar Land. Archaeologists found haunting evidence of dehumanization, bones misshapen from backbreaking labor, gunshot wounds, signs of malnutrition and heat strokes, even chains. The remains were reburied where they were found, but there is no historical marker at the site or any indication of what happened there. So what really happened? We are the Convict Leasing and Labor Project, and we have been at the forefront of the fight to preserve the Sugar Land 95's burial ground and ensure that they're properly memorialized. We believe it is important to understand how convict leasing took advantage of and discriminated against its victims. We also believe it is important to realize that the forces of racism and profit that produced convict leasing have never been fully removed from the American criminal justice system. Convict leasing and the racist criminal justice system that surrounded it is the true backstory to today's over-policing, police brutality, racially disparate laws, mass incarceration, and the prison industrial complex. To learn more, you can download our report, Convict Leasing in America, Unearthing the Truth of the Sugarland 95, available for free on our website at CLLPTX.org. It's time to tell the full history.
Thank you, Elaine. Yes, Hannah, that is such a brilliant video, and the report is amazing, y'all. And in addition to celebrating the release of the report, CLLP is excited to announce that Rice has created 2 new funded internships and a funded travel grant in the name of Reginald Moore, the president of CLLP, in order to ensure that his important work will continue well into the future. So as you saw at the end of the video, our newest report is available for free download at our website at cllptx.org. And make sure to check out TCJC's website at texascjc.org, texascjc.org as well, and check out both organizations on social media. So before we go, I want to say a few quick words about the journey of Reginald Moore, CLLP's president and founder, and how we really got put together and CLLP came to be. I first met Reggie about 5 years ago. He cold called TCJC to ask if we would support his work, which focused on raising awareness of the history of the convict leasing system in Sugarland. I agreed, and I started attending events with Reggie and speaking in support of his work, and was shocked at the hostility with which he was received. Elected officials and government agencies sneered at him, worn out by his persistence and his refusal not to be heard. In late 2017, just months before Fort Bend ISD construction crews unearthed the Sugarland 95, I joined Reggie for a meeting with Dr. Charles Dupree, superintendent of Fort Bend ISD schools. I watched as Dr. Dupree sneered at Reggie's pleas to stop construction and dismissed the idea that the history of the site should be recognized in any way, with Dr. Dupree ultimately refusing even to commit to a commemorative plaque in the new building that was going up, memorializing the history of the site. Months later, following the discovery and the excavation of the bodies, Reggie and I were rushed into meetings with the city of Sugarland and Fort Bend ISD, and ultimately onto a community task force. When Reggie and the members of the community task force convened to determine the proper way to memorialize the Sugarland 95, when that task force refused to go along with Fort Bend ISD's plans to move the bodies, Fort Bend ISD disbanded the task force rather than listen to the community. When a district court judge in Fort Bend County ordered a mediator to facilitate this dialogue between the community and Fort Bend ISD chose instead to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars litigating so that this mediator would never be put in place. Fort Bend ISD's disdain for community input continued with another unsuccessful attempt at a community task force and a blessing of the ground ceremony that went awry and was dominated by community protests. Unwilling to publicly name any of the Sugarland 95 and unable to secure community support of any kind for their plans, Fort Bend ISD moved to quietly bury the bodies of the Sugarland 95 under the cover of night on the day before Thanksgiving in 2019. Our founder, Reginald Moore, who regularly drove by the grave sites suspecting something might be happening, observed the burials as he drove by that night. He pulled over, called me, and got out of his truck to see what was going on. When he went home, after he got in his truck to leave, Reggie was followed and ultimately pulled over by 4 separate Fort Bend ISD Police Department vehicles. He was told that if he returned to the site or went on any Fort Bend ISD property, he would be charged with a felony. Fort Bend ISD, like the city of Sugarland and the state of Texas before them, was attempting to rebury the history of the convict leasing system with the bodies of the Sugarland 95. Their attempt to rebury that history continues to this day, when almost 2.5 years after the bodies were unearthed, Fort Bend ISD hasn't released any of the names of the Sugarland 95 publicly, nor marked their grave sites with gravestones. We must continue to do everything in our power to prevent this dark history, including the circumstances that lead to a school district purchasing prison land in the first place, from being reburied. And though Reggie's efforts were ultimately vindicated by the discovery of the Sugarland 95, it's important to remember on this Juneteenth that there are thousands perhaps millions of other Reginald Moores out there in the world. Black Americans, men, women, and especially non-binary and members of the LGBT community have been pleading with white Americans to recognize and acknowledge the history of cruelty, racism, and complicity that permeates our society to this day. Like Reggie, these voices have been ignored, or worse, arrested, prosecuted, and met with violence. This Juneteenth, we must recognize that the only way to avoid repeating the horrors of the past is by listening to these Black voices who are telling us the truth about our history. And like Reggie Moore, have been ignored for so long. So I appreciate everyone tuning in to the webinar. I want everyone to have a great, happy Juneteenth. Tune in for more. Thank you again to Jermaine Thibodeaux for joining us today and our wonderful moderators. We'll talk to y'all on the next panel. Happy Juneteenth.